Okay.
I'd like to welcome you to the December DEI committee meeting. Let it be known that Brian Hafer and Mark Hetzel are here. Jack Heineman missing for the time. With us, we have Michelle and Randy Gutenberg. Approval of the agenda. So approved. And I don't believe we have any comments. So that'll take us to an update on the reporting tool with regards to concerns from individual students' behavior in the school.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So for the reporting tool, just to kind of briefly retrace the history, we worked on this the previous school year. We introduced it in the spring, at the beginning of the fourth quarter, and that was really our first 3 months with it. And when this information was presented to the full board in July, we said we would come back, and we really saw kind of getting into kind of a cadence of maybe a quarterly or semi-annual report of the data to this committee anyways. But also that we felt from the first 3 months last year, we'd received some suggestions around adding a category on political affiliation beliefs, which we did. And also the original version of the reporting tool allowed for complete, you didn't have to put anything in for a name. So this year we added a requirement that you put in a name. Now, of course, you know, unless we were to try to have some kind of matching system, again, it's supposed to really be a tool for everybody, so that's not it. All we can really do is say you have to enter a text string, set a minimum character limit. I think it's set at 8 right now. And even now we find we do have some individuals, as you can see in here, that are still reporting on an anonymous basis. But you know, I think if you go to the table beginning on the 3rd page, you can see that the unique incidents for the first 3 months of this year compared to the last 3 months of the previous school year are very sharply down. Now, I attribute that partly to, quite frankly, across the board, we typically see fewer serious behavior issues in the first quarter of the school year than we do in the fourth quarter. Secondly, I think some of we had many instances back in the spring when we had submissions that we felt maybe weren't really seriously intended, and we really saw those pretty much come to an end in the first quarter. Plus, you do have to put the name in. So you can see that's down. The next table shows the distribution of what respondents put for who was targeted. It's fairly similar in distribution to what we saw last year. Who was the person targeted? Again, this distribution, how was the person targeted? That distribution is not all that much different. Then if we go to, you know, further on, I think the key thing is name provided by the reporter. And I think what we see here is where previously it was maybe 1 in 7-ish of reports that actually had a name associated with them. It was 50-50. That's the one right there, name provided by a reporter. Now, what this means is we still have, even though they're not blank, we still have 11 responses out of the 22 that are functionally anonymous. And again, these are people that might say, I prefer not to answer. I'm concerned if I give my name, I'll be retaliated again, you know, things of that nature. And but I do think what we're seeing is we are getting a higher percentage of actionable reports. And I think it's, you know, certainly we're getting reports that we can follow up on. And I think it's been helpful to us. It'll be interesting to see as we kind of track this through the rest of the year, whether we see an uptick in reports as we get into the parts of the school year, we sometimes see a little more in the terms of behavior, whether this is kind of our new steady state on the report.
So last year we had a response to 136 reports.
In March,
fall.
April, May, and the first week of June. So we're not comparing comparable parts of the year. We're comparing the spring, the end of the school year, the last 3 months and change with the first 3 months of this year, including September, which is typically a pretty low month
Right.
for reportable behavior.
And we changed it to they had to put in their name?
They had to put something in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are they named?
Well, 11 out of the 22 are.
Okay.
You know, that's a 50% rate, which is up. I guess the better way to look at it is our percentage of anonymous ones, and anonymous ones, you really don't have anything you can follow up on unless they add a tremendous amount of detail in the report, which typically was not the case. It's definitely reduced that aspect.
So the biggest difference we've had in the reporting to us last year, you could leave your name blank, that
Mhm.
space blank. This
Now you
year
have to
you
put
have
something.
to enter something.
Mhm.
So they're either entering their name or they're entering some other characters and the system doesn't recognize it as something other. So that an anonymous one, there's something there, but it's not, something's entered, but it's not a name.
Do we know how many of these incidents are already reported by faculty and staff?
So I don't think we have this broken out in a table, but we do ask, have you told somebody before? And I would want to go back and actually check the reports to make sure I was 100% accurate on this. But there is a certain portion, you know, I'll say maybe a quarter, where the reporting tool is a follow-up on a report that's already been given to a staff member. And when you, if you really dot all your I's and cross your T's when you're doing the report, there's a place for you to say, here is the person I spoke to. So like, if you were my teacher and I already reported it to you, but then I put it in the tool, I could say, if there's a question, have you already reported this to a staff member? I would say yes, and I'd say Mr. Hu.
Okay. Do we track? What's the staff and faculty responsibility to report this stuff? If it's reported to them, do they take it somewhere else?
They're supposed to, yes.
Okay.
And, you know, typically what we find is they've already done that. We see very few instances. In fact, off the top of my head, for something that's been in the reporting tool, I can't think of an instance where something has, you know, I reported to Mrs. S or Mr. Y, and it hasn't already been brought forward to administration. So, but again, that's a subset.
So when you look at these numbers, you know, obviously, fourth quarter, spring of the year, fall of the year. It looks like the numbers are coming down, you know, from this behavioral. Is that because, you know, they're all energized coming in and, you know, they've kind of been together for a year now? And do you normally see that type of activity where, you know, the spike goes back up at the end of the year because, you know, they've been together for a year?
I think we want to go through an entire cycle so we really get to a comparable quarter. But I do think it's I think you've touched on one of the things, Jack. I mean, I do think the spring semester, we typically see a higher volume traditionally of behavior reports than we do in the first quarter. I think also it was the first introduction of the tool last year. We saw some very substantiated reports in the tool. We also saw some very non-serious submissions in the tool. We're seeing fewer of the latter this year, and we hope that continues. I think the other thing to keep in mind is last year, was our first year coming back full time for the entire year after the pandemic. We know, and I think you heard this, in a variety of venues, we saw elevated behavior last year in many dimensions. And perhaps the higher number of reports in here is just one aspect of that. I don't know, Randy, if you have.
No, I think it's it's like Tim said, I think we're going to look at the whole, at the year as a whole. Because we are a cyclical business. I mean, we know generally when we're going to see more things spike. And then and those usually, when you have longer stretches of school without a break, a lot of those do come in the spring of the year. You got the impacts of winter and cold and all those other things that kind of impact things. So we've got to look at it, but was it probably an increase or speculative increase that you launched the tool and now we're gonna be more active in it? Possibly. It's like what Tim said also. I mean, there were some things in there that really weren't what the tool was intended. And I think those still were counted as numbers. I think that adding the name in there, certainly, does that change it? I don't know, but I think it's been it's been a piece we've prompted. We've gotten many more names this year than we've had last year. So, but yeah, it's.
In your survey, do you have areas in the building? That you've identified, I heard this in this area of the building.
We have categories, and so it's not like we would distinguish. Again, if we're all teachers, each of our classrooms, you wouldn't have a selection for each of our classrooms, but classroom versus hallway versus those are all options. And then we encourage students or whoever's entering a behavior report to add as much detail as possible in the description. And, and obviously the more detail somebody provides, if they can provide their own name, then obviously we can follow up with the individual. That's better. If it is something where they have, if it's more digital in nature and they have a screenshot or a video, we can accept a digital submission. That doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened. So they have a lot of ways to provide more detail if they can and choose to do so.
I think the whole piece that we try to look at with the location, and it's true to the reporting tool, it's true to things that we do in our schools on a daily basis, is when you look at, are there trends of behaviors happening at one time of the day or in one location? So use an elementary example, are they happening after lunch recess out on the playground where the kids are playing soccer or football? And you can get it down to that level and know that's what my issue is. Is it with regards to the second recess of the day? Is it passing time between specials? Same thing when you get to the high school. Is it happening in the 100 and 200 hallway versus X? I mean, then at least you can narrow some of those things down and see is there other things we can do. But yeah, that's why it's there, and that's kind of how we then track it. And then if there are trends, then we can target our work towards that.
And this is easy access to students. They all know that it's there.
Yeah, we covered an advisory. There's a link off the website. We also have some QR codes posted at different spots, in all of our schools, but especially the high school. So students can take out a device with recognition and they can initiate it off the QR code.
Tim, what are when you look at the last two parts of your table, individual meetings and behavioral referral response. So again, I'm assuming. No, I shouldn't assume anything. So could you explain what you mean by individual meetings and behavioral response?
So meeting, I mean, if we were to look at how we categorize behavior incidents and what follows from those, actually meeting with a principal or another staff member does constitute a response. However, sometimes it's important to distinguish between a meeting with a principal, an associate principal, or another behavior manager it's more of a fact-finding conversation versus one that's a counseling conversation. So, if the event had enough detail that we could get to a fact-finding conversation. So again, we knew who the student was, who was named in the concern, we could do some fact. That's one thing. Now, sometimes you will begin to look at what occurred, and maybe it doesn't, warrant an actual response, whether it's a detention or a restorative circle or a counseling conversation or a mix of those, up to suspension, expulsion. So, that's what I mean by the individual meetings are going to closely track the non-anonymous reports.
And then the behavioral one is geared towards the
A
person being
consequence.
accused or the person who made the report.
Well, response would be a consequence for if there was somebody who was found to be ineffective.
You have enough information to actually provide a.
Yeah.
If I submit a report with my name. Who reaches out to me? Is it the APs that are reaching out? Or is it a teacher? Or?
It would typically be the principal or the associate principal for the school. I mean, some other individuals get it. Amy Johnson and I get them for the schools at our respective levels. I think, Randy, we still have you on the high school list, right?
I still get those.
Yeah, you still get, yeah, and if a principal wants a member of their pupil services team to also be receiving these, like a social worker, counselor, some principals have elected to do that, but it'll be a principal or an AP follow it up.
And they've worked that out in the buildings as far as how they're gonna respond to those. Particularly if they have a name, if each of the APs has a different case load, and then they'll determine who's this, and then they'll take it from that.
Any other questions on this?
Thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate that.
So another thing, and it got added just today because of how much behavior incidents we had to review. We went through, and you should have a paper copy at your position. This is the derogatory slurs and name calling. And so what we did was we went back to the 2017-2018 school year, and we reviewed behavior incidents from EduClimber. And while we do have on balance a very positive school environment and a very well-behaved student population overall, we're also a district of more than 4,000 students. This is many years, so this ended up being thousands of referrals that we performed keyword searches on. And so in the last paragraph of the first page, the methodology for how we reviewed these years is described. And then when you turn over to the second page, you see a data table and you see a chart of that data table. And so I think our takeaway is we discussed this in the central office at services team is, and again, some of these years are, several years back now, but if this is something where we really do want to track this carefully over time, and I think we should, because you really can't improve things that you care about unless you measure them, typically. Right now, we don't have any specific key phrase or incident type in EduClimber that a behavior manager would check for this in particular. So you really have to go and look at the description of the incident and look at a variety of terms to generate this. So this is not as simple as there was a code that a principal, AP, other behavior manager entered for slurs and name calling. That has not existed in EduClimber. This is based on reviewing the descriptions of these incidents. So, I think that would be probably our biggest takeaway. And that's something that Lisa Jondal, our Director of Student Services, and I have talked about working with our student services team district-wide, as well as our principals and APs to develop some more specific guidance on entering incidents into EduClimber to allow us probably to get a little cleaner set of data on this going forward, so we can track it better longitudinally.
So, go ahead. Go ahead. No, I was just gonna kind of reiterate a couple of things. There's not you can't search slurs and name calling.
Yeah.
You have to go through and actually look at the details, which is what you dove into.
Yeah.
And the other piece is that this includes all name calling.
Yeah.
As opposed to, so it's not just any sort of slurs that might be used, but it's any type of a incident that includes some sort of name calling. And so part of what you're looking at is how do we improve our data and improve our system to make sure that we're entering these things that we can extrapolate them out better.
Right, and so, what we did was we looked at anything that was a kind of a higher level incident, K6, externally managed or major. And then we looked at all middle school and high school incidents, because typically by that level, name calling is a little more significant. So, but you're right, Mandy. I mean, this could be anything from the R word, the N word. It could be commenting on somebody's physique. It could be something, I mean, it could be a variety of things. And in some cases, the actual language, in many cases, I should say, the actual language isn't described in the incident. Now, if name calling becomes a higher tier offense that's reported in there, kind of the assumption is it was a pretty negative utterance. But in some cases, we just don't have that detail in the incident description.
So who enters this data?
That varies quite a bit. Practices vary across schools. In some schools, it would be primarily the person who witnesses the behavior directly entering it into EduClimber. So that could be a teacher. It could be somebody supervising recess outside. In other cases, it might be a verbal report that's related to a principal or an AP. They enter it in. In one school, a lot of this gets routed through an administrative assistant as the first point of entry. So there's some variety in this. I think best practice is in kind of the realm of kind of like behavior management systems is the person who actually sees the event, puts it in. But this is an electronic system. Now, if this happens in my classroom, say this happens in Brian's classroom and he's teaching class and I'm doing some negative behavior in there. He has his computer fairly close in time to the event, if not at the time of the event, he could enter it into EduClimber. On the other hand, if Mark got cafeteria supervision during lunchtime, or Jack, you're supervising playground recess at Arboretum and something happens, you're probably not in a position where you can enter it in right off. So there are a few different ways this type of information gets entered into EduClimber.
So can you use a mobile device to enter it, or is it?
You can, but there are a lot of fields to enter. And so I think staff generally prefer to be at more of a full-size keyboard, but yeah, you can enter these from the phone.
It's also a consistency piece of how we're doing it at a member of schools, making sure every school is entering it consistently and coding it consistently.
Yes.
And that when we have somebody who's name calling, for example, regardless of what it was, that it gets entered in as opposed to things not getting entered and recorded somewhere else. So it's kind of the fidelity of the document in the database as well.
So if I look at 37 incidents, is that for the entire year?
Yes.
All of the schools?
Mhm.
Is it middle?
That met these criteria.
Criteria.
So behind these, I think there's probably about 130, 140 in total. Behind these 130 or 140, there are probably about a little over 7,000 entries that were reviewed.
But these are middle school, high school only.
No,
Right.
this could also happen in elementary.
Okay.
That could happen in the intermediate. The majority are at the secondary level, but we have instances of this occurring in the younger grades too.
So what determines if when a teacher records into EduClimber,
Mhm.
what determines if that's all he or she does plus counts with the student, or what kicks it to a referral
Mhm.
to the office?
So we have kind of a first tier and a second tier of behavior incidents. And historically, these were called minor and major. And those are still the labels we use for the high school. High school is still on kind of a major minor system. For the elementary schools, the intermediate school, and the middle school, beginning last year, they moved to a new taxonomy, which is educator managed and externally managed. So the idea is if this happens in your classroom, and it's the type of incident where you would handle it within your classroom, we still want you to document it, because this is not only we're trying to move beyond kind of the narrow use of this information for kind of, here's the record of the discipline we've done, to that plus we have students with needs for behavior support. Some of that they might just get through additional work with a counselor or somebody else in the school. In some cases, where the students' needs are more intense, that may lead into programs that Tiffany works with. So that's where we've tried to, even if it's something, when you think back to when you were teaching, Mark, you might have handled in the classroom, we still want a record of that, because we want to know over the course of that student's time in the school, are there patterns that may go beyond only your classroom? So even if it's what we might call a low level event, we would want that entered in EduClimber. But then if it's something where it were to need an office referral, that's what we would call externally managed up through the middle school. And typically it corresponds, realistically, if it's in EduClimber at the high school, even if it's a minor, it's something where a piece of paper has found its way to the main office. So we still have some differences in school approaches on this. One thing I can say is that although we still have work to do, our schools are becoming more consistent about making sure they are capturing more of these behaviors. So we do have kind of a more complete picture of what students are doing and where we can help support them.
So how does a red flag come on?
Well, what does a red flag mean for the purposes of our conversation?
Okay, so you just said that if one of the reasons we're doing this is so it's just not documenting my classroom, but we're seeing there's a repeated pattern.
Mm-hmm.
How does that rise to someone's attention?
So there are going to be some events that are significant enough on themselves that sometimes even with one event, it's going to generate what we might call a red flag. I think the question is, when we have a pattern of behavior, not all of which, or maybe all of it isn't really all that intense, but the volume is problematic. So every school has, at a minimum, every school has what we call a tier 2 team. And the tier 2 team will review higher volume students when they meet to see what supports, if any, are in place. Is the student new to the team? Are there things we need to be approaching differently? And usually that might, if that student is not already really, again, more on volume versus intensity, already on that set of students that maybe student services or the administration is working more closely with, that might be the first next step. You also will have cases where you have maybe grade level teams kind of comparing notes, but I think the real area where most of that kind of prioritization would occur would be at the tier 2 level.
Question, we don't have our language down between buildings.
Mhm.
How do we get there so that everybody's on the same page and how long is it going to take?
So I think to get the language the same is something that we've made a lot of progress in over the last year. I think the question is the high school different enough that we keep the current naming conventions for the high school different from elementary through middle school? Or do we think the high school isn't different enough, and at some point they would need to go from a major minor to an externally managed educator manager? It wouldn't necessarily change the incidence at all, but it'd change the groupings about it. And I think the key thing here that would be a change, and it's been a change for some of our buildings below the high school as well, but it'd be a change for the high school, is currently if a teacher at the high school addresses an issue with a student and they don't generate a referral to the office, that really won't show up in EduPlan. Whereas in other schools, if you address an issue with a student in your classroom, even to the point of maybe having a follow-up contact with the family, but you don't move it along to the office, that would be typically in EduClimate. So I think in terms of getting more consistency around tracking these types of events, that's something where Lisa, John, and I are going to work up some additional, I guess I would say, behavior entry documentation and supports for the schools, and we'll work with the principals and APs on that, and also with the student services team. But I mean, I think we still have that question, in terms of the high school, given the number of classes, the movement of the day, the age of the students, do they come into the same model as K-8, or do they have a lot of overlap, but still do some things differently?
I think part of what it is too, Jack, is when we go into these systems, the very first thing we've had to do was normalize language. So it's not like it just was, we adopted this and realized it was inconsistent language. We started with that. It comes down to, like, use an example that's pretty common is Brian and I are doing something as kids in the playground and I push Brian. Is that going to end up in EduClimate? In most cases, I think under our scenarios is you'd want it to make sure that I don't have a history of every recess I just push somebody else. But when does it get entered? And then how does it, I mean, there may be 4 different toggles that could fall under what that is. Is that a disagreement? Is that an altercation? Is it a fight? Is it physical violence? I mean, those are all different examples of what it could be. And that's, I think, what we're finding is depending on the person who's entering it and their perception of what it is, they enter it differently and it sparks differently. So now we've got to say, okay, we all agree these are the 20 different radio buttons, but how are we applying them? Because we're seeing inconsistencies even. And things like, it was difficult for you to get this data because this was a piece that you had to go through and kind of keyword search if they wrote down information in the description. So now that we're looking at more specific and granular data, how do we incorporate that and then bring it forward? So as far as your question, how long does it take? It's in process, it's live action. So as far as when it's not like we're saying it's going to be a discussion now that you now don't do till next year. We can make some of these things as we move and as we have.
Well, I guess the question would be, is this really usable data right now? It's great data. Thanks for pulling it together. But, I think what you want to start doing is seeing trend lines saying it's getting better. Right. And we don't have that necessarily have that mechanism in place to say, you know, these are the trends for these activities.
Well, I think what we have asked them to do is every quarter or something like that, report on it, so we just aren't there yet. So I think, right, I mean, we're still in development, so, you know, you're still 2-3 years away from seeing a trend. To say, what did we do this semester? We had a workshop. Okay, well, that's one thing.
Right.
You know, and we gotta start, then we can connect to, are we doing these things? And is it having the outcome, is it actually doing anything to decrease these incidents? But I think we're still a little bit of a ways from seeing some of that.
And these are systems that, and I agree with that, Brian. These are systems that really serve kind of a broad set of our needs in the area of behavior management. So, you know, here we're looking at it particularly through the lens of our bias incidents. But, you know, these are just a sliver of all of the incidents entered in the system. There's all kinds of things that get entered in. And so, you know, better data quality on the entry always leads to more actionable data. There's no disputing that. But EduClimber, if you were a user in EduClimber, it takes the information and it will allow you to see, when you go in, it'll allow you to, you can customize your search, you know, time frame, types of events. But I mean, you'll get to see who are your most, for lack of a better term, frequent flyers. What are your most common locations? What are the more common times of day? Because, you know, it's not perfect, but we do try to encourage people to be as accurate on the time of day for the event as possible. And you see what are your most frequent events. And you get those as automatic charts. And then I don't want to oversell the analytics, but there is some built-in analytics to EduClimber that will summarize the data for you from the program's perspective. And this is important in terms of our teams in the schools trying to maintain and improve the positivity of the climate. You know, the other thing, and I think you would want to give her time to really be well prepared so she could really present it in depth and in its entirety. But you know, and again, this is a very small portion of students. I don't want to make this sound like this is the main driver here. But, you know, there are some new requirements around identification of students for certain types of disabilities, which do place a greater premium on establishing patterns of behavior. And Tiffany's been doing a lot of really good work with all of our schools on this over the last year. But again, that's kind of beyond the scope of this.
When I look at your comment, Jeff, you're exactly right. When you look at this specific thing, does this drive and help you? It's a piece that we start on, and now we've got to clarify this better. But as a whole, our behavior data does give us good data. It does tell us, as Tim just articulated us up on top, that locate the frequent flyers of students. And then it's also looking at where do we have the most issues? Are we having issues in X hallway, in transitions? What time of the day? Well, what's happening that time of the day? That's where our RTI teams or our PBIS teams, I'm sorry, are really looking at them and saying, okay, so that's part of our goal, is to make sure our transitions between classes, do we have supervision? Have we instructed kids, particularly at the elementary, on what's expected in the hallway so that we have better transition? So that's how it's getting utilized and targeted. So you're not just trying to throw a kind of a shotgun approach at everything. You're saying our data is saying our main behavioral pieces in this school are these 5 things. So let's target those.
So on average, you know, how many reports would a teacher put in per day, per week, or month? Is it 10, 15? You know, because each one of these reports probably takes a couple of minutes to go through the generation down.
I think it varies. You know, partly it depends on, you know, do the students you teach have behaviors that are kind of representative of the school as a whole? Do you maybe work with students that as a group, maybe tend to generate more reportable behaviors. What kind of settings are you in? So, it's safe to say that people who supervise less structured areas like recess are going to generate more referrals on balance than people whose supervisions in more structured environments like classroom settings only. So you'll see staff members who supervise recesses or cafeterias submit more. Our administrators are often in those locations. They will submit more. I think that's a big question, but I think those would be some general patterns, Jack.
And our staff and teachers and playground people, supervisors, they have access, or they have to report them to somebody else?
They all should have access. So if you are a teacher with students on your schedule at Infinite Campus or a principal, you automatically have an account in EduPlanner. The rest, my assistant Lola Baldwig works to keep up to date as we have hires and exits. So if you are a paraeducator, you should have an account that would allow you to enter. And the schools do have people who are resources for staff who may need help. There's documentation to help staff know how to enter this setting. We occasionally will set up a model student in there that staff can practice entering with, so they're not working with live students.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Tim. Keep up the good work.
Okay, that brings us to item 6, update on the student workshop.
Okay, so I've met since we were last together with 2 members of our high school staff, Jessica Main and Megan Baldus, who are working with Michelle McGlynn to plan this up. Their schedules didn't allow them to come here tonight, but they did give me some details that I can relate to you. So kind of where they are at is they haven't selected a venue yet, but the types of venues they're looking at would be the Heritage LGA or the Village Center. They are targeting a half day in either February or March. So again, we are still on track to do this before spring break. They're looking for high school students and student leaders, primarily in grades 9, 10, and 11. So since this would be happening in the second semester, any action ideas that came out of the summit, you wouldn't be losing senior context at the end of the year. So we're really looking at 9, 10, 11. So they're currently in December working on student recruitment. They're going to have a meeting of our interested student leaders on the 5th. So that actually would have been today. And then they will be working with Michelle on a visioning process with these student leaders, keynote ideas, a look at some of our existing data that we have from our data collections at the high school, kind of the large scale surveys and other assessments we've done, again, working with our student leaders, and questions that they were planning to ask the student group today were, what's the best way to engage as many and as representative a group of kids as possible in the activity? And how do we ensure that all students feel like their perspectives are represented? So, as adults, we have some thoughts on tapping students from different clubs and organizations, but also thoughts on, should we tap one student their homeroom? Because then what happens at the summit, you could have a rep report back, but then if it happens in the homeroom, will you get a certain profile of kid out of all the homerooms and then not have, in the end, as representative a group as you wanted? Maybe we blend the 2 concepts. That was one of the big things they're going to talk about with the kids today.
Yeah, I guess comment there. One of the concepts is to get people and groups and talking together. So it would be interesting as if we could get the leadership of, you know, these groups to be part of the planning. Or a representative from each one of these groups, you know, because at least they're starting to have a conversation. They got to work together on a project. And I think that would be better than trying to take somebody from a homeroom. To your point, I think, you know, we could get just kind of same concept.
Yeah, and we may end up doing both, Jack, because you know, our student body overall is pretty well engaged, but not every student belongs to a club or organization. So I think the thinking with the homeroom concept as being part of this was that would give us a communication channel back where every student could get something from a student who had actually been at the summit. But you're right. I mean, that's something we've talked about is you're not going to get that that breadth of perspective if we went the homeroom route only. So what they're looking to do coming into winter break and coming right out of it is kind of finalize the date and venue, announce it, you know, to the student body, and then just work on kind of site arrangements and event planning with the Waunakee Community Cares Coalition. So
I think I've mentioned in the past, Jason Fields
mhm.
from MadRep, you know, has offered to help us. I think MadRep soon, their buildings are ready with the Innovation Center. You know, Jason, you know, brings a diverse background,
Mhm.
and he's really good. You know,
Yeah, I've shared his information specifically with the adult planning too. I don't know if, you know, where we're at in terms of his availability. But they definitely know he's somebody we've talked about, and I've shared his information with them.
So if we haven't decided on a date yet, we're still figuring the date out, or we penciled in a date.
They don't have a date yet. I mean, we're still looking at February or the first half of March, so probably about a 6-week window. But they know that's something they need to do soon so they can advertise it, secure anybody from the outside, secure a venue.
Mhm.
Thank you very much for that. And then next item is A, to review the summary of our original documents from the original DEI recommendations. To that end, you do have a copy in your board book, but I apologize, I don't have a clean copy. I have a copy with my notes on it. So you can ignore my notes if you want.
Thank you, Mark.
So you're not biasing us back here, Mark, are you?
He's being transparent, Jack. We can see
Yes.
exactly where he's at.
I'm just kidding.
All right. So what I thought would be helpful to do is, as much as we can, at least tonight, maybe we'll only get through half of it with the time remaining. But I like to look at each portion and get a sense of, are we satisfied with the way it reads? Do we have a concreteness to it, an accountability to it? And if not, are there some suggestions we could make before we actually finalize this thing? So starting with the first one was building relationship trust to establish professional partnerships between schools, staff, PEO, and administration. I was a little confused. What's the ability?
Yeah, so that's our work group as part of our National Equity Partner Project partnership.
Okay. So that's kind of an ongoing thing.
It is, and you know, I think if the committee was interested in hearing from them, they as a group would certainly be very interested in coming to the committee.
Is the Bella group a local group or is it the contract? group?
These would be our staff.
Is there a team lead for the Bella group or is how many people are in this group?
I would say this year we're looking, I'd have to go look, I'd say roughly 16. Tiffany's part of it, I'm part of it. Our focus this year, because we're really trying to anchor a lot of the work around the elevate assessment, the focus really this year is intermediate up through high school. So the team members are across those 3 schools.
Is there a team lead that could come in and give us an overview and is the entire group?
I think that'd be a good question to discuss with the group. Again, both Tiffany and I are part of the group. I mean, we do have 2 NEP consultants that do meet with the group when they meet. One of them's usually on the West Coast is zooming in though, but I mean, I think, that's something Tiffany and I can take back and see who would like to come in. I mean, I think Tiffany and I are always happy to share with you, but you hear a lot from us. And I think it'd be valuable to hear from some of our other staff that are engaged in addition to, what Tiffany and I could share.
When would be a better time for them to come in and share something of substance with us?
Again, would want to kind of take it back to the group, but I would say probably February or March.
Okay. I'd like to target that then, what should we say?
Do you think that makes sense, Tiffany, or do you see it a little differently?
Is the Bella group part of the other event that we're planning, or is this 2 different groups?
There's a little bit of overlap, but not, I mean, so the event we're planning is high school.
Right.
And the Bell team is comprised of staff at the intermediate, middle, and high school. So, and not everybody who's an event planner for the student summit at the high school is involved in the Bell team.
And then with the PLC Institute is here. They would have been this summer. And do we have a date for that yet?
I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, I believe it's this summer and it's in Madison.
So at some point we'll hear about that at the board level. Okay. Anything else in the first section that anyone has a question on?
When are your professional development days? We have one left in. We have one in January, we have one in.
Late February,
What's that?
one in late
January,
February.
February, May, is that what we have
Yes.
this year?
We hear about that before anyway, so.
Yeah, it's like the last one we had, we were invited back.
Right. Okay, section 2, engage students in our work and develop and improve communications with our students of actions that support their experiences.
So the first one, we kind of, what we're doing over the summit.
Mhm.
So I think we've got a plan there.
So you're saying for that's
Create a student-led leadership team that focuses on creating common goals of safety and space. It's kind of the summit, but I think that's the concept behind the summit.
And I think you've discussed at the full board level, connecting back in with our student groups at the high school as you did last year.
So that
that's
gets
your third
down to
section.
number 3.
Yeah,
Fall, spring listening sessions, and at the last board meeting, we decided not to do those.
okay.
Now. I guess. My vision of all of these, we have budget committee, HR committee, curriculum committee, all coming up with recommendations. I don't necessarily see these as specific recommendations for this year. If we can put them in this year, we can act on them, but. I see this as something that eventually goes to the whole board and says, this is what we want to do, and it becomes a footprint for next year and the year after, the year after. Does anyone see it differently? I guess I say that because like with this particular session as a board, we decided not to do anything until after the conference in the spring with student sessions this year. And so that's not exactly what we decided as a committee, but it's for this year, I think I can live with that. But I think this is an important thing if we're going to engage students, that we do it on a regular basis.
So just to clarify, the summit's gonna be on a school day, half day.
Yes.
Well, I think we should still have an effort to try to get students to at least, if they have something that we want to discuss, they want us to discuss, that they communicate.
Right.
So we can get that on an agenda or attend this meeting as well.
And perhaps what we could do is, if you're open to it, we could put out a communication. What we've done up to this point, and that this is an opportunity to attend this meeting with concerns during the public comment. And I don't know, better to reach us through the affinity groups or through our advisory classes at the high school, middle school.
I think, going to listen to the students and their club. It was kind of an interesting experience, you did a lot of good feedback. Like I say, the last time I went, I thought I was going to be there for 10 minutes and had to say we got other business to do. Well, but I think if we can identify if there are concerns, because I think last year there were a lot of concerns, a lot of seemed like a lot of discipline problems. And I thought it was a good idea, to get in there and try to figure out what's going on. Which I thought that was pretty effective last year.
Okay, so something we'll present to the board for board support as we go forward. Yeah. Question I had with students attending other schools, I think that's a great idea. So is this a suggestion we give to our building principals to work on?
There's some about that. Yeah, some of that happens already.
Okay,
But yeah, is it a piece that we should articulate and look for more opportunities? I think that's what I would utilize it as. Some of this is. Not everything on here is brand new. Some of these are things that we're doing, have done, or continue to do. Some are new. That's something that is in place in some locations, but it's in our, I think I would say we would articulate that we're looking for opportunities to better do that. I think that was a part we had a conversation like when different groups have come into our admin meeting, thinking of when Michelle McGrath came in with her with students. We talked about how can we get them into younger grades. So
right. I think the other thing too, regarding this, if the summit turns out well and gets some good activity out of it, how do we expand that? Almost like a solo ensemble, right? So Waunakee hosted, kind of moves around, to partner districts. Some very,
or even our own buildings, from the high school to the middle school, maybe the intermediate school. So,
sure.
so it's not a one and done kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think, when you look at, I'm sure that each one of these schools have different challenges. You know, and would that be good to bring these schools together to learn about the other challenges and
And some of that, I mean, you have that Dane County equity, that's kind of the concept behind it, was to bring people together, to network, to do things together, get kids talking to each other. With school board members talking to each other, and then to really kind of look at how do we collectively as kind of a region.
is that still going?
Yeah, it's. Started, it's kind of hit a piece where it's, I don't think they've had their first meeting yet this
No.
fall yet, but that will be kind of kicking off.
But
Yeah,
a
yeah.
key activity for that has been a countywide youth meeting the last few years, and I know I have a planning meeting on that Friday, so I know our intention is to run that this year. And I think that's something, if it's an interest to you all, I mean, we can certainly make you aware of that date as it approaches, because I do think we could open that up to board members. I think that sounds exactly, that venue is exactly, I think, the type of activity you're envisioning, Chad.
Oh, plus you also have the spring group, that meets in Madison.
I'm saying, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a similar concept of bringing students together to share what's happening in their schools and things they can do differently.
Well, I think that already exists, so I think what you try to do is try to establish this for us at this point, you know, because I think we're looking at things in our district that are happening.
Right.
And so I think the focus would be developed that leadership out of our group. And then hopefully we'll expand and more people would want to go to these
internally,
because otherwise I don't see a lot of students. They would go in district, but I don't think they would feel comfortable going out of district to do it. So, but maybe in a year or two of participating in this, by the time they're a sophomore or junior, they would be like, yeah, I do want to expand. I want to go outside, but
No, I totally agree with you. I think I wasn't aware that I had this student and maybe we went to that board.
Yeah, they have student ones, there's that group was really divided into things that were focused on how do we network amongst board members, but a huge part of it was how do you get kids involved, because the most powerful part is getting the young people involved. And so that's been a big piece of what that push is, and that's some of the work, and that's the committee that thinks of it.
But I totally agree. We don't want to duplicate efforts. But if we can probably get some excitement and get things moving and going, so that we could probably drive some anticipation.
Great, Alice, can we go on? Or are we good?
We're good.
Okay.
We're good.
Create a comprehensive multi-year and transparent plan vision for work with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion in our schools. I think it reads well. I guess I would see this as our next step.
This is once you get everything back.
Everything back in, exactly, right.
And
The
then
different
you,
groups.
this becomes part of what drives, you put it together, the pieces.
Exactly. Right. With that, I spoke with Randy and I suggest that we would ask different committees who are still working on their recommendations to get them to us by April 1st. And I thought that sounded reasonable for the other committees. Does that sound okay to you guys?
April 2nd is April 1st. is school day.
Yeah, we don't do one thing on Fool's Day, right?
I think the ones
It's
that
serious work.
the ones that it hasn't gone through is budget facilities.
Curriculum's done.
Those ones there, in policy, that's part of what their whole review is. But it's HR budget and facilities are the three that we've got to bring these things back to more specific.
Again, policy is going to be kind of ongoing. It's a process. It's not going to be, it's going to be completed by this year.
That's right.
Okay. Speaking of which, the top item on page 2. I guess I'm still confused as to what our action is on this. It seems they're asking for something concrete in terms of ensuring that practice corresponds to the actual policy. And I'm not quite sure how you monitor that, except by when an incident comes up when there's non-compliance.
Well, I mean, I think. First of all, I mean, when we do have things that come up, we always apply that policy lens. So are we following our policy?
Right.
And I think the other thing is just policies, one important vehicle. I mean, it's something that we should always be doing, and I think it's a key underpinning of, making sure your systems are operating the way you want to, is to look at your results. So we can't guarantee the same outcome for every student, because students have individual differences, and we also value students being able to make their own choices. So we're not trying to get everything cookie cutter, but I do think it's important to look at the results, and are we getting the outcomes we would expect to get broadly, if we were having fidelity with respect to our policies. And then, so for example, if you look at, we've done a lot of great work in this district, thanks to, and I'm not part of the committee, so, it's other people, it's like Tiffany and Amy Johnson and, Steve Summers, especially the Student Financial Assistance Fund. So and the whole purpose of that is so for things that have more cost associated with it, certain types of athletics, other programs, that tends to create broader access. So if those things are working the way we want, over time, we should see, more consistency in terms of access, and not really being dependent on the student's background. So I would say a big part of this, Mark, is just continue, whether it's things like the behavior that we're looking at earlier, other indicators, what's the reality for our kids?
How would you measure that? Just, if you're looking at giving more access, is it just participants?
Well, I think participants is really important. I mean, and again, you can't presume what the right outcome, should be. It's not really about that. But if you see a situation, for example, where low-income students, I'm not saying this is our data, but if low-income students, where 1/4 is likely to be on a varsity sport as a non-low-income student, then that, to me, would raise questions about the fidelity of practice relating to policies. Now, I think you'd want to then kind of catalyze, a lot of different voices, including the kids in the process, to figure out what's going on there. But I mean, I think that's, I don't know. I mean, Manny, I just feel like it's very difficult to be able. There's no real metric for how well are your policies operating. You follow your policies, you look at your performance as a system, and you track back to say, well, is it that we don't have the right policies? Is it that we aren't implementing them with fidelity, or are we looking at factors that go beyond simple policies?
I mean, this goes back to, and this, I'm not trying to split hairs. Policy in our world has multiple meanings. Policy can be the policy book. But we formally adopt every policy, the policy committee looks at it, writes it, brings it forward. That's one policy. It could be a policy that we decide here tonight. We say, you know what? We want name calling to stop. Okay, you can argue that that's written in policy under behavior, but we can say, you know what? One of the things that we're voting on is that we want name calling to be undone. But you have somebody who's not addressing it in their whatever area of responsibility. Is that against policies? You want people to be focused in on what that is. It could be something that is stated as part of more of a kind of a vision type piece, saying this is kind of where we're going. And somebody is saying maybe, oh, I just don't agree with that part, so I'm not doing it. Is that within fidelity? So the policy word in my mind is really hard to define because I don't know specifically what it is. I know what it means, but I can't tell you and write it and state, how do I, it's to your point, how do I track that? I really don't know. I think it's more of one of those things, you see it when you know it when you see it, and you know when it's being broken, when something is in front of you, and then you have to address it. But putting some sort of metric to it or some sort of guide to it, that one's really tough. I get what they're saying. Is that kind of the gist of it here, Tim?
Yeah. I think Gina has a question. You want to indicate it, Mark?
I mean, honestly, as someone who was involved in creating the initial recommendations, it's hard for me to read what is up here and see what it is that we were talking about, because it's been pulled out of the context in which it was written. So I will, if it would be helpful, forward the full recommendations document to the committee members. But for example, this little sentence is part of a second element critical to creating an inclusive environment for students is that they feel safe. Currently, while the district has policies to address these areas, the committee advises the Board of Education to 1, review and update language in board policy, student handbooks, and student handbooks to ensure it is supportive, humanizing, and age appropriate. Like, for example, it refers in the elementary student handbook to perpetrate, which we did not feel was appropriate. So there's a lot more specific information in the initial recommendations, and I would just encourage there would be a less need for speculation about what the intent was if you revisited the original document.
And part of what you're saying, Gina, is what's happening with policy book. Because some of the things that we had a conversation today where we were working through parts of the 300 series, and there were things that were saying revised language that does include updated language of what's more appropriate today than it was in 2002 or wherever it was written. And also pieces we say this doesn't belong in policy, this belongs in the handbook. So what does it say in our handbook? So I think if that's kind of the gist of what we're talking about, and I think that was part of a little bit of the confusion. I think when I look at the policy committee and their role in reviewing the recommendation, it's the policy review. It's review all your policy. It just happens. That's what we're doing right now. Some of that is falling in naturally into the work that we're doing, but we're doing it very sequentially as opposed to piecemeal as far as things that maybe would be identified. There are some policies that are kind of being moved forward quicker because they have more significant pieces that we need to address. So I think if you're looking at that from that's a measurable piece because we're continuing to do it. But policy falls under. But you're right, policy is the policy book. Policy is also the handbooks that we hand out. And I think some of that we're addressing as we're going through and doing it together.
Yeah, I think as we go through these here, we really have to think about what's the action and what's the measurable. How can we get the data to measure to say we are making improvements? So therein lies the challenge, to your point, are more minorities or underprivileged kids playing varsity? How do you track them? How do you, what mechanism, do we use to capture that data? Which. I mean, it's probably a question that we have to pose when we bring forth that. So like right now, and I saw in here about. The fourth item down on the sheet, it was talking about utilize data to recognize areas of strength and determine areas of improvement. One thing you're looking at is receive data on activities, both athletic and co-curricular annually. That was written that way as part of our in the right hand column, because that's when right now we're doing it as the seasons get completed. The co-curricular committee usually meets between those seasons to get the information on participation. But should there be a question posed, as far as it's not only about the aggregate as far as how many people are actually participating, but it's, do you break it down by some of the disaggregated groups, see how does it, of all of our kids who played athletics, what's our balance of kids that are economically disadvantaged versus not? So that might be a piece that we add to like a report that you do in co-curricular. So I think that's how we get to it, is if we want to zero it down more into some of the things that we're gathering, and you can see some of these.
Does the coach necessarily know if they're economically disadvantaged or not, or you know, obviously, you know, the minority or
and a lot of that, I'd have to see if that's, I think that's what. Those are coded in campus, aren't they? As
So
far as participation, how do you?
not everybody can see. I mean, I would, so you can, people who need to know.
Right.
If a student needs an accommodation on fees.
Right.
Have access to that information. In general, there's really no need for people to know somebody's economic status, and we
Right.
generally try to have the settings.
Using the athletic example, they would have a need to know because we waive the athletic. Unless they gets waived.
But that might not happen at the coach level. That might happen in the office.
Right, well, none of our reports come from the coach level.
Right.
They come from, like, our athletic,
The athletic department definitely
Using
could
that.
just could provide
That's
disaggregated.
right.
Yes, absolutely.
yeah,
they
so
could.
because that athletic report right now comes out of Aaron's office.
Mhm.
And he would have the ability to disaggregate, he could put that data to it. If that's what he
Yes.
wanted to see.
Yep.
Correct.
Good.
So there's-
well, and I think, you know, obviously we want to collect data and we want to move forward, show good trends, things like that. But if we're not going to use it, there's no reason to collect it.
Yeah, you don't collect it just to admire it. You use it as a guide to act.
So it's just.
No, I think that's a good point, because, you know, a lot of times we see data and we're done with it. And I think it's important, if with regards to DEI, if we get this kind of report, we can look at some areas where we can ask the question, why, and what can be done.
I think that's one, I mean, I'm just looking at the athletic, I'm looking at you, Brian, because that's when we'll be setting a meeting here coming up for the fall sports. And we'll be looking at participation, we could disaggregate some of that down further, kind of at a larger level, just to see kind of what it looks like.
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking, I mean, there's some information you just don't want out,
Right.
like a team of 15. There are 2 people on the, you know,
Yeah, right.
I,
And we can put an end number to when you show it. I mean, that's kind of what we do at the level with school report cards. There's a point where you just.
Yeah, I don't know that you'd want
Even
to
if it's-
break it down by team.
By sport, no,
Right now, I'm
a
thinking
bigger
about
picture.
if we took all fall sports, for example, and just broke it down as that large number, how many kids participate, because we know that.
Mhm.
They kind of broke it down by, and we can just do it as a percentage piece.
right.
Can show us at least what it looks like. And I compare that to the percentage of what our population is.
So would you say that there's a high percentage of students who participate in activities where the fee is covered that matches the free meal program, or I mean, is it the same?
Once they hit the free meal piece, then their fees are covered.
For all activities and stuff?
Generally, I believe.
They don't have to request it, it's just.
I believe so, but I'll double check on that, but I believe so, I believe that just rolls through them, so like their. Fee that we charge the
whatever, $60-75 for sport, I think that gets really, I'll double check on that.
I'm just trying to think of an easier way to say, a certain percentage of students who participate in activities in general are also on the free.
Yeah, we can do it.
That would tell them.
Okay, I'm gonna suggest, if you don't mind, that the three of us are, and of course, Randy and Tim. You're welcome to do so as well, but while we look at. Review the last 2 pages. Before we come back, if there's a way, something we think that would help crystallize. What we want to happen, like I said, I think the top one is really vague, and so. If you have any suggestions before we make this our final copy, that would be really helpful, and that would become one of our main agenda items. Anything else for the next meeting?
Do we want to set that date?
I'm sorry,
Did we want to set the date?
that we would.
Yeah, we've been running on a consistent date, haven't we been?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's usually like that first full week of the month.
Yeah,
Yeah,
It's
so
not necessarily a specific date or day.
I don't think we need to meet before the January meeting, do we? That first week's gonna be tough.
Well, yeah, the first week is the 9th, you're right, or the regular meeting's the 9th.
so we prefer to wait till after that meeting. Sure.
I think so.
All right.
And you have met that week too, like the week right after the board meeting.
Right.
Like this week of the January 16th.
16th or later, the week of the 9th after the meeting. But
Do you want to do the 16th in the evening? Does that work for you guys?
yeah.
23rd. The board special meeting, is that another curriculum one, Tim?
Yes,
Yes.
it is.
The 30th is the curriculum presentation.
Yes,
That's right.
Yeah, so how about the 23rd?
23rd better.
23rd is a good one.
there we
Yeah,
go.
good for you. 5:30?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here in the meeting.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? I guess
No.
we're finished. Opposed? No, we're ready to go.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
We do.
Appreciate all your help.